Siman Reish Nun Gimel. Anyone know what it discusses? Siman Reish Nun Gimel without looking inside the Mishnah Berurah. Something to do with Shabbos. Very good. Close. Shehiyah. Okay, now the fun begins. Okay. The emphasis is, I just want to point out, we're still dealing with halachas of Erev Shabbos. That's how we begin. Reish Mem Beis, Reish Mem Gimel, Reish Mem Dalet. They're all dealing with halachas of Erev Shabbos. Reish Mem Gimel is also dealing with halachas of Erev Shabbos because the whole din of Shehiyah is a halacha in Erev Shabbos. You're not allowed to leave food from Erev Shabbos on Shabbos, which is uncooked. So the Gemara has a machlokes between Chananya and the Chachamim. How much does the food have to be cooked before you could leave it on the flame, on the fire, for Shabbos? According to Chananya, if it's already Michael ben Josai, you could leave it on the flame, and there's no chashash that you might stoke the coals and be over on Havara when stoking the coals. And according to the Chachamim, it has to be Mevushal Kal Tzarkai, not just Mevushal Kal Tzarkai, but if it's Mitztamik V'yafalai, it's still problematic. Mitztamik V'yafalai means that even though it's already edible, it's totally cooked, but a cholent, the longer it stays in the flame, the better it becomes. The longer it sticks in the crock pot, the better it becomes. That's called Mitztamik V'yafalai. So according to the Chachamim, even though it's Mevushal Kal Tzarkai, but if it's Mitztamik V'yafalai, it's still also. There's a chashash that you might stoke the coals, and therefore, only if it's Mitztamik V'rala is it mutter. How do we paskin? Shulchan Aruch brings the Chachamim. It says that it has to be Mitztamik V'rala. Unless it's Mitztamik V'rala, it's also to do Shehiyah. And then he says, V'yeshaimrim Shkal Shezbashal Kamecha B'Jusai mutter. So what's the klal in halacha when the Shulchan Aruch brings two shitas, and one is stama and one is a yesh aimrim? The last one is a yesh aimrim. The halacha is stam yesh aimrim, halacha kis stam. It's the halacha. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins l'chumra, like the Chachamim, that you're never allowed to do shehiyah on a food that's fully cooked, even if it's fully cooked, unless it's mitztamik v'ralei. The Ramah, on the other hand, paskins like the Chachamim. The Ramah says, I'm sorry, Lechananya. Thank you. The Nag L'Hakal K'Svara Achrayna. We're Noig L'Hakal like Chananya. Like the last Svara that the Shulchan Aruch brings. Now we're just Chananya. That's a kula. And on that, is a famous Bir Halacha who brings the Rosh. And the Rosh says he quotes the Rosh like this. I'm going to read you the Bir Halacha. It's very negeya. Ein beBeis Yosef sheherich harma be'elu hashtei deyes. The Beis Yosef is marich in these two shitas. V'hatik divrei harosh shekasav, and this is the Rosh Lashon. The mepneishi Yisrael adukim b'mitzvahs Einik Shabbos, because such a beautiful lashon, because Klal Yisrael is adukim, they're so attached to the mitzvah of Einik Shabbos. B'vadei lo yishmu lanu, and they won't listen to us if what? If we're machmer like the Chachamim, they won't listen to us because they want to keep their food on the flame, making sure that it tastes very good for the mitzvah of Einik Shabbos. Again, hanach lahem, leave them, let them be, let them do like Hananya. So the Bir Halacha is medayik from the Rosh, and he says like this: Mashma mizeh, it's mashma from the Rosh. The rak mishem zeh loyrotzal lemchais. It's only because anyways no one will listen to us. So therefore we're not going to be meichel. We'll be makel like Hananya. But meikar adin, what's mashma from the Rosh? Meikar adin will be makel like Hananya. But what's better to do like a tchila? Tchila should be machmir like the Chachamim. That's what the Bir Halacha learns, and therefore the Bir Halacha says, Ravada, Lefiza lakatchila bavada toiv lizoyer shemavushul kal tzarka koydem mechasheicha. It should definitely mavushul kal tzarka. That's the Bir Halacha's achra. That lakatchila you should not leave food on a flame, even though it's mavushul kal meichel ben jisai. A person should make sure it's mavushul kal tzarka. That's the Bir Halacha's achra. The Chazon Ish learns on this Rosh. It's choyluk on the Bir Halacha's pshat in the Rosh. He says that the Rosh never meant to say. I think in the newer Mishnah Berurahs when you have the Chazon Ish in the back, they'll be mitzayin the Chazon Ish on this Bir Halacha, and they'll say, which the Chazon Ish says that the Bir Halacha's pshat in the Rosh is wrong. Really, the Rosh means to say that because we're adukim mitzvahs Einik Shabbos, and people wouldn't have listened to us, so therefore we'll paskin like a tchila, like the makilin, and therefore you could leave food on the flame no problem, as long as the Moshe Kameichel B'Jusay. Okay, that's a machlokes b'Alach and Chazon Ish. Definitely, Yeshal Milismach, if you want to leave food, a pot of food on the flame without doing garv, gruflik or whatever, without doing a blech, there's definitely Mokum Malach. What is, as long as it's Meichel Ben Jusay, but what is Meichel Ben Jusay? How do you know if something is already Meichel Ben Jusay or not? So first, what is Meichel Ben Jusay? This is machlokes Rishonim. The Rambam says Meichel Ben Jusay is. Rambam says it's chatzi bishul, it's half cooked, and Rashi says that's a third. So machlokes Rambam and Rashi, what is Meichel Ben Jusay? Now, how does the Shulchan Aruch paskin in this machlokes? So it's a very interesting stira. In Reish Nun Daled, Shulchan Aruch paskins like the Rambam. You need at least that it should be cooked l'chumra. It has to be cooked at least halfway. And in Siman Kuf Yud Gimel in Yeridea, that's talking about Bishul Akum. There, the Shulchan Aruch paskins l'kula. He says, I think he speaks about it over there. He says over there, with regards to a guy that cooked food that was already cooked, K'meichel Ben Jusay, whether there's Bishul Akum in that. He says that there's no Bishul Akum in that because it's considered cooked already if it's a third. If it's Meichel Ben Jusay, and there he says a shlish Bishul. So it's Mavur, the steer in the Shulchan Aruch. Here he passes that Meichel Ben Jusay is Chatzi Bishul, like the Rambam, and there he passes that shlish Bishul, like Rashi. So the Magen Avraham says that really we pass like the Rambam, like Rashi, that shlish Bishul is already enough. But Le'inyan Shabbos, because of Chumra the Shabbos is so Chumra, will be Machmer like the Rambam. So therefore we have to be Machmer like the Rambam and make sure that if you want to leave food on the flame without a blech, you have to make sure that it's K'meichel Ben Jusay. And what is Meichel Ben Jusay? That it's cooked halfway. Now halfway cooked is a very difficult thing to determine when it's halfway cooked. How do we determine what's halfway cooked? Says the Chazon Ish that it's very easy. You take any food, whatever food you're cooking. Let's say you're cooking eggs, right? You're making eggs, hard-boiled eggs. Cooking eggs. So how long does it take to cook eggs? It takes 20 minutes, 15 minutes. Let's say it takes 20. Let's say it takes a half hour, just for conversation's sake, right now. It takes a half hour. So the Chazon Ish says, so what is a third of a half hour? 10 minutes. What's half? 15 minutes. So Chatzi Bishul doesn't mean in Eichus, in the quality of the Bishul, it means in time. Each food will be different. You take the food and you measure the amount of time it takes to cook that food from the point of Yatzir Ledes, from the boiling point, from the point that it becomes hot, till the point that it finishes, and you measure that amount of time, and you cut that in the middle, and whatever half time, that's
Same thing.
Huh?
Same thing, if you go by time or by the name.
But how could you measure names?
No, you can't measure name really, but it's basically it's the same thing.
No, it's not something I'll tell you.
The end point is being cooked and the beginning point is not cooked.
There's a big chiddush, I'll tell you.
That goes along.
Dan, it's a big chiddush.
So I guess the third way where it's the same.
I think most people don't hold the Chazon Ish.
We don't hold the Chazon Ish. I'll tell you why. There's a big chiddush in Chazon Ish. Some foods, I don't know, I can't tell you, you have to speak to a cook. But some foods don't get cooked until the very last 5 minutes of while it's being cooked. Some foods, it takes the entire bishul process until the last 5 minutes. The final 5 minutes, until then, it's not fully cooked. It's not cooked at all. It's not even edible. So according to the Chazon Ish, as long as you waited half-time through, whatever the half-time was, through that bishul process, you're good to go. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's even edible b'shas atchak. So that's a big problem, and that's why most places don't go with this Chazon Ish. The Chaf HaChaim L'Mashal says that Einon Bekian, we're not Bekian in this shear of Meichel Ben Jusay B'chalal. We can't really be Meshayir. What's Meichel Ben Jusay? The main thing is, if you want to rely on Chananya, the Ramah, that we could be Masha food, as long as it's Meichel Ben Jusay, you have to make sure that it's edible b'shas atchak. How do you make sure? Try eating it. Try eating it. Taste. See, is it edible? Kaf Chaim says you got to taste it and make sure it's edible because we don't know what the shear is. We can't give you a shear. But the Chazon Ish seems to say as long as you waited half of the time of the bishul process, that's already Meichel Ben Jusay and you could rely on that. But we don't pass it like that.
Was this Ben Jusay, was it only with meat that he used to? Or was that?
Ben Jusay was a fellow. Oh, what did he do it with?
Did it with meat, no?
Well, yeah, could be done with meat, but the point was that he didn't wait till it was fully cooked. So that's why we attribute the name of Meichel Ben Jusay to any foods. even though he might have done it only with meat. But there's a very interesting thing you should know. Water, for example, doesn't have a shear of Ma'achal ben Jasai. Because what's the bishul point in halacha of water? When is water considered mavushal? Any liquids? When it's yatzir letes by. When it's yatzir letes by, it's considered mavushal. Before it's yatzir letes by, it's not mavushal. There is no point in time in the bishul process of water that you could say, well, this water I could drink b'shas chak. Either it's hot or it's not. Right? If the bishul of liquid is the heat, so is it hot or not? You can't. Only with salads you could say svar of ma'achal ben Jasai. So that's why you have to be very careful. Some people, they forget to put up hot water before Shabbos in their urn, and right before Shabbos they want to put a hot water in the urn. That's shehiyah, because when is the bishul process going to take place? In Shabbos. That means in Shabbos, when Shabbos after Shkia, right? You did it a few minutes before Shkia. In Shkia, after Shkia, when it's Shabbos already, you're going to have uncooked water being boiling in the urn and cooking on Shabbos. That's a problem of shehiyah. Now maybe you'll tell me that your urn doesn't have a dial, that you can't really increase the heat temperature, so therefore there's no problem of shehiyah, because the whole problem of shehiyah is because maybe you might increase the temperature. So there is a way that you could cause it, you could make it cook quicker, even without a dial, is if you take out some water. If you take out some water, the less water there is in the urn, the quicker it cooks. So there is a problem that you might take out water and make it cook quicker. So that's a problem of shehiyah by water. And by water, there's no heter ma'achal ben Jasai. There is a very interesting argument made by some achronim that our ovens, the gas ovens, are not included in the gzeira of shehiyah. Very interesting taina. The Arletzian says, the Ritzin Avishel says, that what is the problem of shehiyah? What's the problem? Gzeira shami yichata. You might stoke the coals. So he says, why would a person stoke the coals in the olden days? Because the coals, the fire would diminish, right, would decrease, and you had to somehow stimulate the flame that it should be magbir and magdil, increase the flame. He says, but our ovens, our stovetops, right, nothing happens. As long as you have the gas running, then nothing decreases. The fire doesn't become smaller. So there's no problem with Shami Yichata. There's no Gzeir Shami Yichata by us. That's what he wants to say. But Shlomo Zalman says that that's not the only reason why a person would stoke coals in the olden days. A person would stoke the coals also because he wants to be memaher the bishul. He wants to make sure that it cooks much quicker. So even if the flame didn't decrease, it didn't become smaller, he would want to make it bigger. So here too, you could make the flame bigger, right? You could up the gas and make the flame bigger. So therefore, there's still a problem Shami Yichata, and that's how the person can paskin. But there's an additional. Even if you say that, Rabbi Moshe has a ga'onish svara in the Igros Moshe Chelek Aleph. He says that the Gzeir Shami Yichata means that you'll take the existing coals and you'll play around with it. You'll stoke it, right? But when you turn up the flame, what are you doing? You're not playing around with the existing gas. You're adding gas. So he says. He compares it to a different halacha. There's halacha Shulchan Aruch that if a person would make a flame with straw, with kash, the halacha is there's no Shami Yichata there. Why? Because the halacha is because the metzius of kash is the straw gets consumed by the fire. So there's nothing to play around with. There's nothing to stoke because if there's no fire, then nothing is there. There's nothing there. So Rabbi says there's no chashash that a person might bring more kash and add it to the flame. Here we don't find Chazal with Geyser. Maybe you'll bring more kash and add it to the flame, and therefore we should require you to cover the straw. It says here also, Chazal never with Geyser that you might add eitzim, you might add something to the flame. They only said that the existing flame you might play around with, and therefore make sure you cover it. Say by our gas ovens, what are you doing when you up the gas? When you increase the gas, you're basically being moisif. You're adding something that wasn't there before. That wasn't the Gzeir of Shami Yichata. So Rav Moshe takes issue with the entire Gzeir of Shami Yichata with our stove ovens, with our stove tops. But nevertheless, of course, la halacha, we are machmer, and we say that you need to cover it. But it's just an interesting svar to know that there are svaras lahakol by our gas ovens.
So Shlomo Zalman, if it's on its highest when Shabbos comes in, can't make it any higher.
Excellent. The price can speak about it. Let's say it's on its highest. So would that be compared to, let's say, where there's no dials at all, like a platter, right? There's no dials at all.
You can still reduce the amount of food that's in there and cook quicker.
So you could say that, like the water, but we're not chayshish for that because that's not the derech to do. Water, the way you use an urn is you take out some water. But the way you use a pot is you don't leave the food in the pot, you take out slowly food. I'm saying whether if it's cooked, you take it out. If it's not cooked, you don't take it out. So there's no chashash on that. But there's a loy plug. They say even those who agree that by a plata, we say that it's mutter because there's no dials, there's no chashash on yechata. But if you have dials, then there's a chashash. Even though we don't find such a gzeira that you might come to be maktin the flame and then be magdal it, but there's still such a chashash. Yeah, okay.